Welcome back to the Fourth Way Podcast.
Roland Allen's The Spontaneous Expansion of the Church, Chapter 3. Modern Movements Towards Liberty. In this chapter, I compare two theories of missions, and rejecting the theory which aims at the establishment of a church by the process of devolution, examine recent efforts to follow a practice more in harmony with the practice of the apostolic age, and show where it has fallen short. It is, I suppose, now almost universally admitted that we cannot hope, by multiplication of missionaries, to reach the vast populations of China, India, and Africa, not to mention the rest of the world, nor to cover the whole of these great areas with mission stations, still less to provide mission schools and hospitals sufficient to supply their needs. The demands made upon us by our present missions for money and support tend rather to increase than to diminish from year to year. Dr. Arthur Judson Brown has pointed the moral for us. Speaking generally of the work of societies, European and American, he says, "Some of the most expensive missions in the world today are those which have the largest native churches. Surely there must be an end to this process sometime. If we are to admit that the more successful the work of establishing a church, the greater is the obligation of the home church to sustain its various needs, it is not difficult to foresee disaster." Mr. G. Hibbert Ware, speaking from the point of view of the missionary in charge, is not less emphatic. If the mission, he says, is to be expected not only to gather and train the new congregations, but to keep hold of them, and to control their organization and finance, and to raise up and supervise their clergy, and all this for an undefined period which may run, as it has already in some cases, into 50 years, then one may well ask how long this process can go on, how long the mission will be able to support the growing burden of its congregations. The limits which bound this method of propagating the gospel must be comparatively narrow. Thoughtful men have now for some years been urging that we are rapidly coming to the end of our tether, and that we cannot hope to multiply our stations much further. If we attempt to satisfy a demand for new missionaries and new stations which increases with every new station which we establish, and if the stations which we at present hold are, as they notoriously are, inadequately staffed, and if we find it difficult, as we undoubtedly do find it difficult, to secure sufficient men and money to maintain our present stations, schools, and hospitals, and if we attempt, as we must attempt, to carry the gospel to the whole world, is it not apparent that the size of the work and the method do not agree? Yet in practice, we are still acting as if we could go on multiplying mission stations indefinitely. Even if the supply of men and funds from Western sources was unlimited, and we could cover the whole globe with an army of millions of foreign missionaries, and establish stations thickly all over the world, the method would speedily reveal its weakness, as it is already beginning to reveal it. The mere fact that Christianity was propagated by such an army established in foreign stations all over the world would inevitably alienate the native populations, who would see in it the growth of the domination of a foreign people. They would see themselves robbed of their religious independence, and would more and more fear the loss of their social independence. Foreigners can never successfully direct the propagation of any faith throughout the whole country. If the faith does not become naturalized and expand among the people by its own vital power, it exercises an alarming and hateful influence, and men fear and shun it as something alien. It is then obvious that no sound missionary policy can be based upon multiplication of missionaries and mission stations. 1,000 would not suffice. 12 might be too many. Many have realized this and have argued until it has become an axiom, repeated, if not clearly understood, by all our leaders, that our missionaries must aim at laying such a foundation that India may be evangelized by Indians, China by Chinese, Africa by Africans, each country by its own Christians. That certainly must mean that our missions ought to prepare the way for the evangelization of the country by the free, spontaneous activity of our converts, and that their success must be measured not so much by the number of foreign missionaries employed, or by the number of converts, as by the growth of a native church and the power to expand. But when we ask how the way is to be prepared for that free, spontaneous activity, we find divergent opinions and no settled policy consistently followed by our missionary societies. Many seem to act as if they still believed that it is our duty to carry the gospel to all the inhabitants of the globe ourselves. Many simply employ as many native agents as possible and call that the evangelization of the country by the natives. Most attempt at the same moment to follow different and opposite methods, hoping to reap some benefit from each and utterly unable to make up their minds to pursue any consistent policy. Among those who think seriously about the preparation of converts to evangelize their own countries, two conflicting theories involving two conflicting methods of missionary work are widely held, and these demand our careful consideration. On the one hand, there are those who hold that it is our prime duty to establish in each country a church, not necessarily very widespread nor very numerous, but highly educated and equipped with all the help that science and art and organization can supply. That we ought to concentrate upon the few even within the church, educate them in the arts of healing and teaching and church government, establish them in our doctrine and ethics, and so prepare them to direct the church in its great missionary work when the time is fully ripe and the church, so founded, has advanced to such strength that it is not only able to take over all the work which we have begun, but to carry it forward into all the corners of the land. Those who hold this view, and they are very many, are apt to appeal to the authority of Christ himself in support of their theory. They say that Christ concentrated on the few and trained apostles who should afterwards guide and direct his church in the great missionary enterprise which he set before them. And they urge that, if we would follow his example, we should make it our chief business to train leaders and to build up the church which they may lead. Now we cannot but observe that there is a great gulf between the training of leaders by Christ and the training of leaders in the hands of these men. Christ trained his leaders in 2 or 3 years. These men have been training leaders for more than 2 or 3 generations. Christ trained his leaders by taking them with him as he went about teaching and healing, doing the work which they, as missionaries, would do. We train in institutions. He trained a very few with whom he was in the closest personal relation. We train many who simply pass through our schools with a view to an examination and an appointment. Christ trained his leaders in the midst of their own people, so that the intimacy of their relation to their own people was not marred, and they could move freely among them as one of themselves. We train our leaders in a hothouse, and their intimacy with their own people is so marred that they can never thereafter live as one of them, or share their thought. I have heard of students in theological colleges so ignorant of the religion of their own people that they had to be given lectures on it by their foreign teachers. Thus, whether we consider the length of time devoted to the training, or the number of the leaders trained, or the character of the training, or its manner, or its method, we perceive at once that the training of leaders of which we speak is something utterly different from that which was set up as an example, and to which we appeal as the authority for our practice. If the end which we have in view is the evangelization of the country, and it is to do that work that we establish in the church and train its leaders, then our training should be training in evangelization. But in the theory which I am now examining, there's a distinction between the training and the evangelization. The church is to be founded, educated, equipped, established in the doctrine and ethics and organization first. Then it is to expand. The insertion of this term between the first evangelization by foreigners and the second evangelization by the native church introduces a grave danger. In putting the advancement of the church first, we teach the converts that the leaders whom we train, so soon as they arrive at consciousness of the direction in which they are being led, to look upon their own progress as of the first importance, to concentrate upon themselves. But that is not training for the evangelization of the country. Great advance in this direction is compatible with a complete absence of any zeal for the conversion of others, and indeed is at times definitely opposed to expansion. For instance, I was told the other day that there was a considerable feeling amongst the younger and more highly trained Christian students in India against the admission into the church of a large number of illiterate converts from among the outcasts, on the ground that such admission tended to lower the prestige of the Christian church in India, which had, through many years, built up a reputation as a highly educated community. We need not be surprised at this, for we are quite familiar with the unhappy fact that it is possible for Christian churches to be highly organized and equipped, and yet to fail utterly to understand the necessity for carrying the gospel to the people around them. History is full of examples and warnings. Some utterly perished, some survived, persecuted and tormented, and some degenerated in faith and morals. He that saveth his life shall lose it. That danger hangs close on the heels of a practice which puts the elevation of a young church in the foreground and treats the work of evangelization and expansion as something which must follow. But it may be said that those missionaries who believe in and practice this theory do not neglect to keep ever in view the evangelization of the whole country as their ultimate object, nor do they neglect to train the native church for that work. They establish missionary societies and boards of missions as part of the organization of the church, and already these societies and boards have sent out missions into other parts of the country. To this it must be replied, first, that these societies and boards, being fashioned in a Western model, have been established and can be established only after a long period of preparation, during which the native church is being educated, so that, in fact, the term between the first evangelization by the foreign missions and their agents and the second evangelization by the native church remains. And it is in the introduction of that term that the danger to which I have pointed lies. Again, missions thus made a department of church organization hold the same relation to the great mass of the Christians which our foreign missions holds to the great mass of Christians at home. They are foreign missions, supported by funds to which the Christians may or may not subscribe. They are one department of church organization among many others designed for the equipment of a well-constituted church, and they are the one department which could be weakened or neglected or abolished without any immediate and uncomfortable consequence for those who neglected them. If any other department, the medical or the educational, or the church sustentation department, for instance, were neglected, all would speedily feel the consequences. Thus, this objection that expansion has its place in the education of the native church as a department of church organization, even where it is really made a department, does not at all invalidate my argument that the introduction of a period in which the church concentrates upon its own advancement opens the door for all those dangers which beset the self-seeking. When new converts are trained to look forward to a day when the church of which they are members will attain to such strength that it will be able to carry on all the work which its foreign teachers began, when their leaders are trained to do precisely the same kind of institutional and organizing work which the foreign teachers have done, there arises a serious danger of conflict. And when, as at the present day, there is a strong tide of national feeling opposed to foreign domination, this conflict, which would, in any case, be inevitable, is quickened and exacerbated. Missionaries often say that the resentment expressed by the more highly trained and intellectual of our converts against the domination of the foreign missionary is only a part of the universal national feeling, which has been so marked a feature of the last few years. That is not an adequate explanation. The form of expression is molded often by the common national unrest, but the conflict between the missionaries and the leaders whom they have trained was inevitable, and would not have failed to appear even if there had been no national movements, for this conflict arises out of the very nature of the case. We are constantly being told that the very object and meaning of the training of leaders for the church is that they may lead the church and carry on all those works which the foreigners inaugurated, so that the foreigners may be able to retire and enter upon fields as yet untouched. All have been told again and again that such is the missionary's design. Young men are then trained to lead, and, as generation after generation passes by, impatience inevitably grows, and would grow if there were no national movement to excite it. The longer he stays and the more elaborate his institutional work becomes, the less does the foreign missionary seem prepared to retire to give place to the native leaders whom he has trained. The native students have been trained to lead, and they have been trained to express their powers by doing precisely those things which the foreign missionary does. But when they have been trained, they find that the foreign missionary cannot trust them to do the work sufficiently well to relinquish it to them, and that only subordinate posts are open to them. It is easy for the foreign missionary to say that only generations of training will produce the character and capacity to direct such a great and important undertaking. But these young men see their fellow countrymen taking the lead in great commercial and political and social movements, and they, not unnaturally, say, if the foreign missionary trains us to lead, he ought to entrust us with the position of leaders. Hence arises an inevitable struggle for the control of church policy and administration in the church councils, and for the higher posts in the church and in mission institutions between the missionaries and those whom they have trained. For they have trained them not for a work in which there is unlimited opportunity, but for the tenure of positions of which there is only a limited number. But that the history of the advance of the church should be the history of a struggle between the foreign missionaries and their converts for the dominant positions in the church is deplorable. The immediate result is that missionaries find it more and more difficult to attract the more intelligent and capable young men to prepare in our institutions for church work. From all sides, we hear the complaint that the ablest men hesitate to put themselves or their children under our training for this purpose. From all sides, we hear that, were we to have had training institutions longest, there the zeal of the church for the propagation of the gospel is weakest. There the complaints that we do not give the natives sufficient authority are bitterest. And there the tendency for the church to become self-centered is most marked. Thus, this method must inevitably lead to disaster. In some parts of the world, able young men, trained in the way which I have described, are already agitating. In India and in South Africa, there are loud threats of revolt, and our leaders already begin to fear schisms of the most serious character. When these mutterings and threatenings become violent, then our missionary statesmen begin to talk of devolution, and of nice adjustments of claims, measuring carefully how much they must resign, and how much they can still afford to retain in their own hands. But they do not consider that everywhere, where now there is apparently perfect calm, and their sway is still undisputed, they are pursuing a method of training which must inevitably lead to the same trouble in years to come, and that they are preparing for their successors difficulties compared with which in magnitude the present difficulties appear like a small dust in the balance. Whilst these missionary statesmen are busy about the nice calculation of more and less, they fail to see that their compromises can never bring peace, and that everywhere they are taking a course of action which can only end in a struggle for power. They imagine fondly that they are quite ready to retire when the leaders whom they train are ready to take their place, and that the moment when the native leaders are ready will be so obvious that they will all agree it has come, and that then there will be no difficulty in handing over authority. The moment is never clear. Those who are seeking to gain authority never agree to wait until those who hold it think that they are sufficiently prepared. The moment arrives only when those who are seeking to gain authority are strong enough to drive those who hold it into concession by threats of revolt. The inevitable result of this method is discontent and strife. On the other hand, there are those who think that as a work should end, so it should begin. If the propagation of the gospel is to be at any time the spontaneous work of native Christians, it should be so from the very beginning. Every moment of delay is a moment of loss for them, loss for their country. There has certainly been of late years a steady movement in the direction of encouraging, recognizing, and above all, expecting great advance to be made in this way. Perhaps because the leaders of missionary societies are more and more inclining to lay stress on concentration and institutional work, and consequently are little by little withdrawing from evangelistic work and starving it. The small force of evangelistic missionaries, seeing their numbers decreasing, and their power waning in proportion to that of the workers in the institutions, are becoming more and more inclined to look upon the growth of the church in numbers by the spontaneous activity of their converts as the only hope of future evangelistic work, and are being forced, by the withdrawal of supplies of men and money from home, to look to the supplies of men and money on the spot with new eagerness and understanding. Whatever the cause, a movement in that direction is clear. Before, however, we consider this movement, it is essential that we should examine a formula in which the Bishop Tucker of Uganda, following Mr. Venn, summed up the object of our missions as the foundation of self-extending, self-supporting, and self-governing churches, because it has exercised a very great influence over the thought of those who are moving in the direction of the establishment of indigenous churches. This formula, popularized by Bishop Tucker, was itself a symptom and a cause of this movement, for Bishop Tucker himself proclaimed it in days when the rapid growth of the church in his diocese lent a peculiar force to his teaching. His formula passed almost into an axiom, so that it is today repeated on all hands as an axiom, whilst yet on two important points, its meaning has never been made clear, either by him or by his followers. The first of these is in relation to the three terms in his formula to one another. The second is the meaning of the word churches. 1. We constantly hear men use these three terms, self-support, self-extension, and self-government, as if they were distinct and separate things, and we find that men have aimed at one or another of them more or less by itself, as if it could be detached from its fellows. I believe that a moment's thought will reveal the fact that they cannot rightly be so treated. Self-support is universally considered a mere matter of finance. No more striking example of the extraordinary materialism of our missionary outlook can be found than this, that we can only with definite and painful effort think of self-support in any other terms than that of money. The moment that we hear the word self-support, we think at once of money, and of money only. But any true self-support is more than financial. However wealthy a church might be, it would not be self-supporting unless it supplied its own clergy as well as its own church building. However poor it might be, it would yet be self-supporting if it did produce its own clergy and carry on its own services, though its ministers might receive no salaries, and its services be held under a tree. But the ministry is certainly the key of self-government. Bishops and priests imply government. A church which could and did supply its own ministry must be to a large extent self-governing, or at any rate could be self-governing, for it would have within itself the keys of government and authority. Thus, self-support and self-government are closely knit. And as for self-extension, it is surely plain that a church which could neither support itself nor govern itself could not multiply itself. Individuals in it might make converts from outside, but those converts would either be dependent upon the church to which their instructors belonged, or would be without any government at all, mere isolated churchless Christians. If the churches of our foundation are to be self-extending in the sense of self-propagating, they must necessarily possess the power to create their like, and unless they are self-governing and self-supporting, they cannot possibly propagate themselves. How can a church with no government of its own create a self-governing church? The formula demands that we should establish self-supporting, self-governing, and self-extending churches, and obviously, if it applies at all to us, it applies likewise to the churches which we establish. If we are to establish self-supporting, self-governing, and self-extending churches, so certainly must they. If the rule applies to the parents of the first generation of churches, it applies to the parents of the second generation, and to the third, and so on. Thus, self-extension is bound up with self-support and self-government. The three are intimately united. Whether Bishop Tucker perceived this or not is not clear, but it is quite clear that his followers all over the world who quote his formula have not perceived it, for they attempt to seek each of the three terms of the formula separately, at different times and by different means, and this, as we shall see, has led to weakness. Bishop Tucker did not make clear what he meant by churches in his formula. Number 2. What are the churches which are to be self-governing, self-supporting, and self-extending? In the New Testament, I find such churches: the church of Antioch, the church of the Thessalonians, the church which is at Corinth, the church in somebody's house. I read of the churches of Galatia, the churches of Asia, the churches of Judea. These churches were local groups of Christians fully equipped with ministers and sacraments, and were exactly what Bishop Tucker desired the churches of our foundation to be: self-supporting, self-governing, and self-extending. But I do not know whether he was thinking of churches like these, for in our day we more often speak of churches of our foundation in a very different sense. We speak of the Church of Japan, the Church of China, the Church of Uganda, the Church of South Africa, the Indian Church, and so forth. These are churches very different from the apostolic churches, and their self-support and self-government and self-extension are very different from the self-support, self-government, and self-extension of the churches of St. Paul's foundation. They are in character national churches, like the Church of England, and if they ever establish other self-supporting, self-governing, and self-extending churches like themselves, they must do so in some other country than their own. For in their own country, they can only extend by increase in the number of their members in the subdivision of dioceses. That is, by the lowest form of propagation by fissure. Whilst the churches of St. Paul established new self-supporting, self-governing, and self-extending churches like themselves in the nearest towns and villages, not by fissure, but by spiritual procreation. They differ also from the apostolic churches in another more important particular. In those churches, ministers and sacraments were provided for every little group of Christians. In these, our foundation, they are the peculiar property of a few favored centers, whilst the great majority of the Christians are compelled to live without any resident ministers, and thus their priests are not local, and resident officers must but mere occasional visitors, and the administration of the sacraments becomes an occasional and rare, instead of the normal and constant element in their religious life. So far as the majority of Christians are concerned, their familiar and everyday guides and leaders are young lay catechists and school teachers. These churches, then, are utterly different in character from the apostolic churches. Finally, they differ from the churches of the apostolic foundation in that they are largely supported and directed by foreigners. If such churches can be called churches at all, it is only by identifying the foreign bishops and missionaries with them. Whereas the apostles were never the local pastors and teachers and directors of any of the churches which they founded. They were members of them in virtue of their common membership in the unity of the church, which was composed of all churches. But they were not members of the local church viewed as local churches, and did not control the details of their social and religious life as local churches. They had nothing to do with their local finance or church building or anything of the sort. Those churches were never dependent in any sense upon ministers of money derived from some outside source. Consequently, if we make any distinction in our minds, and we can hardly avoid making the distinction, between the native Christians and the foreign missionaries supported by foreign funds and employing foreign funds in their administrative work, we see at once that the native Christians cannot be a self-supporting, self-governing, and self-extending church apart from the foreign missionary, bishops, and their missionary assistants, until they are capable of assuming control of all the manifold and complicated machinery of a great national institution. For though they may be very small in numbers, in the midst of a vast heathen population, yet their machinery is designed for great national churches. Consequently, until they can carry it, the missionaries who imported that machinery must bear its expense and burden. It is true that many missionaries like to do this, but whether it is wise to load a small body of Christians in a heathen country with the cumbrous machinery of a great national church, and whether it is wise to subvert the whole apostolic conception of the church in order to do this, is perhaps open to question, and I venture to question its wisdom. If anyone says that the word Churches in the formula refers to the little groups of Christians in the towns and villages, and that Bishop Tucker habitually spoke, as his successors do, of these churches, then all I can say is that St. Paul certainly did not found churches without local ministers and sacraments. If the local congregations are in our eyes churches, then we must acknowledge that, since these churches have neither ministers nor sacraments, we are creating a new type of church, which has no biblical authority whatsoever, and is not in harmony with our own prayer book, which, following the Bible, takes it for granted that local churches have local ministers and sacraments. The prayer book certainly does not contemplate churches ministered to by lay catechists and teachers. Still less does it contemplate half a dozen or a dozen such in the care of a lay catechist. Yet that is a common thing in the mission field. In the Telugu country, a catechist has charge of at least 10 or a dozen congregations in as many villages. In February 1924, Bishop Lasbury told us that there was only one clergyman for over 100 churches in the Isako country on the Niger. In the CMS report for 1923 through 24, we are told that in Nigeria, the Reverend C.W.F. Jebb, who is in charge of the Owo district, is responsible for no less than 250 churches, including several in the outlying region of Kaba, and that in Uganda, one native clergyman is responsible for 185 churches. Another is responsible for 205 churches. There are young teachers responsible for 40, 50, and 60 churches, and to superintend this great work, there are just 2 European clerical missionaries. It is impossible for us to call such congregations churches in the biblical sense of the word, unless we are prepared to maintain that the Pauline churches were mere collections of Christians in towns and villages, without local presbyters and local observance of the Lord's Supper as their regular common service. I am persuaded that this is wrong, and that our attempts to found national churches without the substructure of the local church is a mistake. Those little groups of Christians, which are sometimes called churches, but are not, ought, as I think, to be churches in the biblical sense, and ought to be instituted and equipped as the Pauline churches were instituted and equipped. And then the unity of these would represent, and might one day become commonly recognized as, the national church of the country. But to begin with the national church and to build on that foundation of local groups of Christians which are not churches seems to me a fatal inversion. I believe that we ought to return to the apostolic practice and found churches in every place where we make converts, churches equipped with all the divine grace and authority of Christian churches. It would appear as if Bishop Tucker had formulated the truth by a kind of inspiration, but that he failed to bring it to the birth because he did not attempt to reconcile the idea of the churches, of which he spoke, with the idea of the churches from which he borrowed his inspiration. He allowed that word to escape from him unquestioned and undefined, and consequently, the church over which he was set as a bishop in Uganda boasts that it is self-supporting, whilst it depends, and depends in a very real sense, upon large grants from England. Boasts that it is self-extending, whilst it cannot propagate itself, for though it can multiply Christians, it cannot beget churches. Boasts that it is self-governing, whilst its foreign bishop and his assistant proclaim that it must have the guidance of bishops and superintending missionaries from England for long years to come. If Bishop Tucker had accepted the apostolic idea of churches and had followed the apostolic practice, there might and would have been in Uganda hundreds of self-supporting, self-governing, and self-extending churches today, whereas now we receive the same kind of appeal from Uganda that we receive from other dioceses abroad, which make no boast of being self-supporting or self-governing. Now we shall find, when we examine the modern movements toward spontaneous expansion, that this confusion exercises a very disturbing influence. Men constantly use the word church, both of the church of the country, and also of any one of these little groups of Christians which have neither local presbyters nor sacraments, as though each was a church in the apostolic sense of the word, whereas in fact, neither is such. Confusion here must inevitably lead astray men who desire to see the propagation of the gospel in any country, the spontaneous work of native Christians from the very beginning. So long as we continue to think of the churches which we are to establish as great national churches, composed of huge dioceses, governed and directed almost exactly as our churches are governed in England, but composed largely of congregations, which are called churches and are not, it is almost impossible to conceive the spontaneous activity of native Christians resulting in the creation of new churches. But the movement that we think of churches in the apostolic sense of the word, we see at once that the spontaneous activity of the individual members of such churches might very speedily result in the multiplication of churches all over the country. We can now consider what movement has been made of late years in this direction. There is certainly today amongst many of our missionaries a tendency to encourage their converts to teach others from the moment of their conversion. That may seem a very strange thing to say, and it would be a very strange thing to say unless it were still somewhat rare, and was not even now checked and hindered, often by those who desire it most sincerely. It is hindered by a very widespread conviction amongst our missionaries that new converts, so far from evangelizing others, need to be nursed themselves if they are not to fall away. We often hear some such expression as this: even after baptism, the new life in Christ must be carefully tended, or inevitably the first fervor will cool, and the early enthusiasm will be quenched by the deadly heathenism all around. That is a voice with which we are very familiar, which teaches that the way to retain the consciousness of a gift received is not by handing it on to others, but by learning to depend more and more on teachers, and that it is our wisdom to expect nothing from our converts, but to watch over them and nurse them and feed them. It is a voice which appeals more and more insistently for paid and trained workers to guard and to protect a life which must otherwise inevitably be quenched. It is hindered by a very widespread conviction that we cannot trust untrained men to propagate the faith. That is openly said by many. By many more it is believed, or half believed. Even those who encourage their converts to propagate the faith have doubts in their minds, and hasten to supply teachers to take charge of any work which they find to have been started by the spontaneous zeal of native converts. And they do this, even when they know and confess that the teachers whom they send are very inadequately trained, and certainly have not the initial zeal of those whom they are sent to supplant. That such action must check the spontaneous activity in the future of those who are so treated is obvious. When men are allowed to think that when they have begun to learn and to practice what they have learned, the way of advance is to surrender their activity, they speedily learn the fatal lesson of inactivity. More cautious or timid people, who might have been inspired by their success to imitate their example, are checked and wait for the trained and paid teacher, whilst inquirers and heathen onlookers learn from their own observation that in the eyes of the missionaries the teaching which the untrained zealous convert gives spontaneously and freely is to be lightly esteemed in comparison with the teaching of the paid native agent. They all learn this lesson the more readily when they find that it is the proper thing for converts to pay the salary of a mission agent, because the payment gives his teaching still more importance in their eyes. It is hindered also by an action of ours which is designed to support it. When converts are taught from the very beginning that they receive to hand on, and when they practice this with the inevitable consequence that there is a great advance made, and when this is reported at home, it often results in our being stirred to send men and money to establish institutions for their intellectual advancement, and to supply them with better trained teachers. Now this action, which is designed to encourage them and to help them, seems often to hinder them. They learn to receive, they learn to rely on paid and trained men. The more teachers they have, the less they feel the need for exerting themselves to teach others. That is perhaps quite natural, but it is disastrous. More serious, however, than any of these is the fact that this personal evangelism can never come to fruition in the establishment of the new churches, except in that form of church guided by lay catechists or teachers under the supervision of superintending missionaries, which we have already rejected as unapostolic. In early days, one of the most powerful causes of the expansion of the church was the presence of the apostolic churches with their ordered life and spiritual rites in the midst of the surrounding heathenism. That influence is not indeed destroyed, but it is weakened very seriously by the fact that the churches, which result from the efforts of spontaneous evangelists today, are not really native, but dependent upon the care of foreign superintending missionaries. Any graces which the new Christian community shows can be ascribed to the influence of the foreigner and to his direction. They do not spring plainly and unmistakably from some new spirit brought into the life of men who, in all respects, live exactly as their heathen neighbors, except that they use strange religious rites and are somehow subtly different from other men, and do the same things as other men in a different spirit. That witness of the corporate body cannot be clear so long as the government of white men and the control of an imported teacher stand in the foreground. Self-extension by the mere existence of a purely native church is hampered and rendered difficult because men cannot see it apart from the influence of the foreigners. The evangelistic efforts of the spontaneous evangelists are clear, but he is followed by the paid teacher and the paid cleric, and behind all is the white superintendent and the white bishop. They are never forgotten, and where they appear, the witness of the life of the native church becomes misty and blurred. All progress can be ascribed to their influence, their teaching, their schools, their control. There the spontaneous effort of the native evangelist is marred, and the witness of the Christian community, which he gathers together, is marred. Only when the non-Christian population is face to face with a change in their neighbors and an ordered church life of their neighbors, which can be ascribed to no white influence, are they compelled to face the fact that they are in the presence of a spiritual force which is strange to them, in the presence of the Holy Ghost. Nevertheless, there has been in the last few years very considerable advances so great and in so many different parts of the world that it is making a serious impression upon our minds. If it is true, as it is true, that outcasts in India and laborers in Nigeria and Uganda and China and Korea are capable not only of being led and directed to do this work, but of doing it spontaneously of their own initiative, not in one or two rare cases only, but in many, we cannot but be impressed. The same results seem to follow the same teaching all over the world. The conviction that new converts can beget new converts leads them from strength to strength. The conviction that they will fall if they are not nursed leads them from weakness to weakness. The difference lies not in the nature of or in their environment of the converts, but in the faith of the missionaries. Self-support is a strictly financial sense, is now one of the popular cries in the missionary world. For a long time, men thought it impossible. They declared that the poverty of their converts was so profound that to expect them to provide the material for their common religious life was absurd, and many of our missionaries still say the same thing today. But that self-support from the very beginning is possible has been abundantly proved, not only in rare, sporadic instances, but by the wider experience of those missionaries who set themselves to encourage the evangelization of the country by their converts from the very beginning, that in spite of the fact that they laid upon them a very heavy and wholly unnecessary burden by insisting that they must support paid teachers and catechists, and sometimes also clergy, paid at a rate which approved itself to the foreign authorities. In Uganda, when the rapid expansion of the faith began, the leaders of the movement saw the necessity for ensuring that the new converts should supply what was necessary for their church life, as they understood it, and they made it their boast that in Uganda, all native buildings and all native teachers were supported by native funds. And what was proved to be possible in Uganda has been proved to be equally possible in all the other areas where converts have been encouraged to propagate the faith from the very beginning. This is indeed far from being the same thing as the complete material and spiritual self-support, which was without doubt the rule in the church expansion in the early centuries. But it is unquestionably a movement in that direction, and with very beneficent consequences. In Korea, the self-support method succeeds. Where this principle has been conscientiously followed, there the churches are many and large. Where churches are helped most, there they are weak, lifeless, and helpless. This may be easily verified. Go where you will throughout Korea. This is what we should naturally expect. Nothing is so weakening as the habit of depending upon others for those things which we ought to supply for ourselves. Nothing more undermines the spirit which should express itself in spontaneous activity. How can a man propagate a religion when he cannot support, and which he cannot expect those whom he addresses to be able to support? We ourselves can only propagate a religion which we do not expect our converts to be able to support, because we think that we can supply those necessaries which they are unable to supply. Even we ourselves are beginning to see, as I pointed out earlier in this chapter, that this puts a very straight limit to the extent of our work. Had it been only in consideration of this limit, those who desire to encourage a wide extension of the church would have been compelled very soon to strive to the uttermost to induce their converts to give as much as possible towards the maintenance of their churches. And this is what we actually see in the case of great numbers of missions, which practice a kind of bastard self-support, which is little more than an ill-disguised attempt to wring from the converts as much financial help as possible. The stipendiary system, which we have treated almost as if it were divine in its origin, makes this inevitable, and it issues in sad appeals. Since 1922, I persevered to declare about self-support to every station, to every church, that they ought to offer 6 pence everybody, but they cannot do anything. And I fail now. I cannot do anything. I hope my Lord Bishop, he will decide this case about self-support. Nevertheless, though our steps are hesitating and slow, we are learning a lesson which will one day open the door to true spontaneous expansion. We already began to see that the Christian faith is not a way of salvation only for the well-to-do, and that no people are so poor that they cannot maintain all that is necessary to their salvation. In the matter of self-government, we have made the least advance. If missionaries have hesitated to believe in the power of the Spirit of Christ to inspire their converts to preach the faith which they have found, if they have hesitated to believe that poor native converts could supply the material necessary for their corporate religious life, they have hesitated still more to believe that converts could direct their own religious organization. Even those who have proved by experience that new converts can and will, from the very beginning, propagate the faith, supply their own church buildings, and even support financially their teachers, hesitate to believe that they can and ought to direct their church organization from the very beginning. Take a case like this. A few days ago, I had a letter from the African pastor who was in charge of a part of the district during the absence of the superintendent. While making a tour in the Akoko country, a deputation from a village that I had never heard of came to beg him to pay them a visit, saying that their membership was now about 600. I went there, he says, and found their statement true. They had been gathered in by a number of young fellows who had gone down the country to work, and had come in touch with CMS workers, had been converted and baptized, and then returned to found a church in their own village, and to teach all that they had learned. What splendid zeal! What a glorious opportunity! The pastor has appointed a teacher, a young fellow who had lived with me, and had learned something with a view to becoming a teacher. He's a convert himself, very young and poorly equipped. We have set him a hard task. The arrangement is not ideal, but it is the best that we can do. Now here it will be at once observed that the little group had organized itself and could maintain itself. Its members met for mutual comfort and support. They combined to provide themselves with such things as were necessary. They were directing all their own organized religious life until the day they invited the visit of the foreign-trained pastor. Here was self-government from the very beginning. If only that self-government had not been destroyed by the foreign missionary, but had been regularized by the bishop. If their leaders had been ordained, there's no reason in the nature of the case why they should not have continued as they had begun. Then we should have seen true spontaneous expansion, issuing in the creation of a new church, self-supporting, self-governing, and in all probability, self-extending, for this treatment of the first pioneers would certainly have encouraged their converts to follow their example. But what did the superintending missionary and his African pastor do when they met a case like this? They immediately sent a teacher to those people, a man who is described as very young and poorly equipped. Now, why did the missionary superintendent hasten to send a very young and poorly equipped teacher to a place where most zealous teachers had taught, and with such success that they had gathered a congregation of 600 souls? It was not because there were no other openings for him, because in that very same article the missionary told us that inquirers in most promising cases turn away from us because of continual disappointment, as the teacher they had waited and begged for never came, and they had no one to guide and support them. Then a Mohammedan came along and drew them to the faith of the false prophet, and those who might have been pillars of the village churches have been taught to become the bitterest enemies of the cross of Christ. If the man were fit to be employed at all, he might have been sent to one of these. It was not because the new teacher was likely to be better than the old, for though he may have had a little more knowledge of the missionary's doctrine, he had not the zeal which converted 600 men. It was not because by sending him the missionary established the church. He did indeed bind that group to the mission, but he did not establish the church. Were they any better off when another layman was sent over them? They were in worse case than they were before. But their leaders needed help and felt the need of help, and therefore they invited the pastor to visit them. Well, of course they needed help and felt the need of help, but were they helped? I venture to doubt it. To have taught those men a little more, that they might have imparted it to the rest, would have been help. To send a very young and poorly equipped teacher to supplant them was not a help but a hindrance. We ought never to send a mission agent to do what men on the spot are already doing spontaneously. If they cry to us for help, as they often do, we should give them help, but help would be which would support their position and assist their zeal, not supersede them and kill their zeal. Help that should strengthen them as leaders, not make them subordinates. To supersede them is disastrous. I remember once asking a missionary from Western Africa whether he had ever known natives to set out on their own initiative to teach others what they had themselves learnt of Christ. And he told me how a missionary on a journey found in a village a number of men who met together to hear the Bible, read, and pray, and that their leader was a native Christian who had learned something at the mission station. I asked him what the missionaries did when they made the discovery. They immediately sent a teacher, he said. Then I asked him what became of the man who had first begun the work. He answered that he heard no more of him. That is the natural consequence. If the moment that we find anyone doing anything spontaneously, we send a paid man to do it for him, we stop his work and we check others from following his example. All men see and learn the lesson to join the white men's church. It is necessary to induce the white men to send one of his trained teachers. They see and learn the lesson that the spontaneous zeal of native Christians is deficient in some way. It obviously does not satisfy the white man and his paid native pastor. They do not trust it. They do not encourage it. It is better to get a paid teacher, however young and poorly equipped, than to have a most zealous, unpaid volunteer. For the moment that the white man finds out what is going on, he will certainly insist on sending one of his paid teachers. The result is that we kill voluntary, spontaneous activity on the part of our converts, that all men believe that the presence of a paid teacher is essential for their admission into the Christian church, and that the progress of the gospel is limited by the number of paid teachers available. Expansion ceases with the failure of the supply of natives trained by us. If the natives are converted to any other religion than the religion of Christ, they can direct their own religious life. The Muslim, for instance, does not nurse his converts nor send them paid teachers. Converts to Islam seek teaching for themselves, that they may lead their fellows. They travel sometimes from Nigeria to Cairo to learn. Christian converts are taught to cry feebly for teachers to be sent to them. But why do we do this? That question I shall attempt to answer in the following chapters. Here, all that I need to do is to beg those missionaries who say that they are anxious to see the church expanding by the spontaneous activity of their converts from the very beginning, to consider what is the inevitable consequence of actions like this. The story which I have quoted is not a rare and exceptional one. There is scarcely a country in the world from which we have not heard the like. Everywhere, by robbing new converts of the liberty of directing their own religious life, which they enjoyed before the mission teacher was sent to them, we produce the impression that, for some reason, their religious life ought to be directed by the white missionaries and their paid agents. But if men believe that the Christian religious organization is one which cannot direct for themselves, how can they continue to propagate the religion? Their own experience shows them the spontaneous zeal of men untrained by the foreigners is inadequate. That some half-trained, paid man can do what spontaneous zeal cannot do. That is, consolidate and establish the church in its relation to the church of the white missionaries. If the growth of the church depends upon the supervision of foreigners and of natives trained by them, the extent to which it can grow is severely limited. It depends upon the area which the foreign missionaries can cover, and the number of men whom they can train. The moment that limit is reached, expansion must cease. And long before that, the sense that men are propagating a system of religion which is so unsuited to those whom it is preached that they cannot receive it and practice it, for themselves exercise a very severe restraint. We feel it ourselves. Its influence is most baneful. All our missionaries run with their faces turned backward. The moment that any door of opportunity opens before them, they look behind for support. They continually bemoan the fact that their greatest difficulty, their most serious anxiety, their most bitter disappointment arises from the lack of support from home. They cry for recruits, and recruits fail to appear, and they see the door of opportunity closing. And the whole body of converts learns this lesson, that expansion depends upon the supply of trained mission agents, that the religion which they have adopted is one which natives cannot maintain for themselves, that they must have a foreign overseer or a man sent by a foreigner to minister to them. How can spontaneous expansion flourish in an atmosphere like that? Until we learn that not only self-support is in a financial sense, but self-support in a spiritual sense, a sense that implies self-government, must begin from the very beginning, we cannot hope to see that wide propagation of the gospel which alone could penetrate a continent like Africa, or reach the vast populations of India and China, or cover those widely, sparsely populated areas where communications are difficult, or find an entrance into those countries or districts where the government is definitely opposed to Christian propaganda, places into which no white missionary can penetrate, and where no mission station can be founded. For such work, the church must be free with a freedom of which we now scarcely dare to dream. Spontaneous zeal leads Christian men to teach others, often in secret, often at the risk of their lives and property, and they must be able not only to convert, but to organize their converts. They must be certain that no white missionaries, no paid agents, no foreign societies are necessary for the establishment of the church. They must know where to turn for holy orders. They must be sure that holy orders will be conferred. Church must beget church, as individual begets individual. Is not that the only way? Or is our way of looking hopelessly into the world and saying, "This is closed to us. That is unreachable. We have not enough paid workers. We cannot afford to open a new station. A better way?" Could we once persuade ourselves that self-extension, self-support, and self-government go hand in hand, and are all equally the rights of converts from the very beginning, we might see such an expansion of Christianity throughout the world as now we little dream of. The refusal to recognize that self-government is necessary for new converts is threatening to produce most serious consequences. There is that in the gospel which demands expression, and is never satisfied without propagating itself. We have seen again and again in the history of the church that a Christianity which does not propagate itself languishes, if it does not perish. And this is as true of new churches as of old ones. Wherever the Spirit of Christ is, there is the Spirit which desires the conversion of the world to Christ. And when men do not find adequate opportunity for its expression, the spirit of discontent and strife enters in. At the present moment, we hear on all sides mutterings of a coming storm. In India, in Africa, in China, there are movements which call themselves Christian, movements which certainly could not have existed if our missionaries had not been there before them, which are definitely anti-European and anti-missionary. Within the circle of those whom we call our members, there's a grave discontent. If we continue much longer in our present way, it seems to me to be inevitable that, as our converts all over the world advance in education, so this discontent will grow. The result will be a schism of the most profound and far-reaching character. We must remember that the vast majority of our converts have been, and are being, educated independent, and that the vast majority of our missionaries have not advanced even to the point of believing in the desirability of spontaneous expansion from the very beginning. Even those who believe in its desirability are commonly under the impression that they are laboring with all their might to stimulate it, whilst they are practicing those very things which hinder it. I hope that I shall succeed in the following chapters in persuading my readers that the methods which we have generally followed hitherto have sprung into existence as the almost inevitable consequence of our own attitude and training, and that in employing them, we have unconsciously and often unwillingly created an atmosphere in which spontaneous expansion is almost impossible. It is high time that we should definitely face the question whether we will not in the future return to the biblical apostolic practice, and by establishing apostolic churches, open the doors for that expansion and make it the foundation of our missionary policy. For we are at a turning point in our missionary history, and what is to be the future course of that history will depend upon the attitude which we take up on this question. So, before I expound on this chapter just a little bit, I need to address something that may be kind of hanging out there for somebody. It can seem really arrogant for for Christians in general, and talking about missionaries, this guy, this author in particular, talking about people seeking to propagate the faith, make converts. It can seem really arrogant, especially in modern day, like to think about going into another culture and essentially changing them. I wrote something on this a while back. I think a good analogy, if anybody is familiar with Star Trek, would be like the whole show throughout the series, and I'm thinking Star Trek: The Next Generation. There's this cyborg. I think that's what he's cyborg. I can't think of the other word for like a robot thing, but there's this cyborg who named Data, who is part of the crew, but obviously he's a machine. But throughout the whole series, they're trying to get him to understand human humor. And it's fascinating because they want him to essentially become human in that way. And they want it not just for their benefit, so that he can understand their jokes, but so he can take pleasure in it too. So it's almost like a Data becoming human. And I don't think anybody who watches that show would say it's arrogant for a human to desire, this character who feels very human to viewers. It's not arrogant for them to want him to begin to understand humor, because this cyborg who basically impersonates a human and feels very human to the crew, they want him to be as human as he can be, right? They want him to experience that because they know the joy of humor and the way that it brings you closer to people, the social aspect of it. That's what makes you more fully human. I think I know to a even much greater extent, if somebody believes that Christianity is true and that there is a loving Father who desires all people to know him, and that he created the world with purpose, and that if you know that purpose and the way that things are supposed to work, and you live by those standards, then you will be more fully human. You will realize your humanity the way that things ought to be. You will live more at peace with others, more at peace with yourself. Like that is a good desire to bring people to that knowledge. Now, certainly it can be done in a lot of very bad ways and has been done imperialistically, where you're not only kind of helping people to become as fully human as they can be, but you are trying to change their cultures beyond that. You know, changing a tribe from being warrior cannibals is a good thing, no matter how deeply ingrained that is in their culture. Don't go murder people and eat them. That's a good thing to stop doing. But other aspects of the culture, like don't get tattoos, don't whatever. Obviously, you can get tattoos for certain reasons that may not be good, but in general, having people stop all of these other things that are part of their culture, not great, right? So certainly there's a line there, but just having the idea that going into a culture and trying to convert people is bad, like you got to get past that hurdle first. If you understand that there are good ways to try to help people become more fully human, just like helping data to get humor and to become more human is good, then you're going to be able to understand Alan's dilemma here a little bit more. In this chapter, this is maybe the most boring chapter in all of his work, but he's essentially just going through and looking at the way that Christians and paid workers kind of stymie the growth of churches, and how it's not an apostolic church, right? The way that churches are propagated, at least in Alan's day, and probably still very heavily by missions agencies, is to essentially rely on paid workers to create dependency and to only allow the stamp of legitimacy to be placed on a church if it's associated with a paid missionary. So even if the missionary kind of hands it off to a worker, they hand it off to a paid worker who's associated with the missionary, and the so-called church, which Alan argues usually isn't really an apostolic church because it doesn't have those three characteristics of self-government, whatever the other two were. A lot of times there's only legitimacy if it's tied to the missionary, right? And so Alan's talking about how this kills the zeal, right? It creates dependency, which kills initiative, kills zeal, when really you're just kind of systematizing things. It's really just an imperial structure, right? What do imperialistic nations do? They go out and conquer and attach tethers economically, militarily, otherwise. They attach these tethers and make other nations essentially vassal states, sort of. That's really what, in Alan's day, missions was doing. And there are still active components of the modern missions movement that's still doing this, as well as vestiges of it where people are trying to throw it off, but finding that there's still a distaste for missionaries in the mouths of people in the lands that they're trying to minister in. So Alan, I think, uncovers this very well. Like I said, it is kind of the most boring chapter because this is a lot of the setup, but he's going to get into some really important details that aren't just applicable if you're thinking about missions and what that looks like, but that were really profound for me in terms of my Christian life, because he's going to address what does it mean to propagate Christianity? What does it mean to have zeal? What does it mean to be responsible for propagating the faith? Because one of the reasons that a lot of people don't trust, I guess, native Christians in whatever country they're doing missions work in, is because they think, well, we've got people who are better trained, and they're very nervous to hand that off to people who they feel are inadequate, under-equipped, however you want to put it. And they're nervous that they will essentially lose control. And God needs things under control. He needs things in this nice, tidy box. And Alan's going to go into that and give some really solid examples and explain why we have a huge fear of that kind of thing and why we really need to rely on the Spirit. Because when we have this much control over things, like we saw in the last chapter, it just creates a huge distaste in the natives' mouths for the gospel, when otherwise they would have zeal for it and it would be transformative. So anyway, this was the setup. I hope you'll come back for future episodes and hear more from Alan.
That's all for now. So peace, and because I'm a pacifist, when I say it, I mean it. This podcast is a part of the Kingdom Outpost Network. Please check out the links below to find other great podcasts and content related to nonviolence and kingdom living.